introductions and the great start. So hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are participating from. So welcome to the session 2 of Dislocating Coloniality, Lived and Digital Religious Flows Across the Indian and Pacific Oceans. I wish to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathering today. We pay our respect to the local people for allowing us to have our gathering on their land and to their elders, past, present, and future. To introduce myself, my name is Praveena Rajkobal, and I am a research fellow at Deakin University in Melbourne, working with the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization. So it is my pleasure today to share this session, and we have two great speakers, as Anna already introduced. We have Professor Michael Okyerefo from the University of Ghana speaking to us today, and then we have Dr. Dickie Sofian from the University of Gadjah presenting on the topic of transnational religious flows in the Indian Ocean. So I hope I pronounced your names correctly. So moving on, so there will be a time for a couple of immediate questions for each presenter. So each presenter have a 20-minute speaking time, and then the session will go on for 1 hour and 20 minutes. So after speaking, after the first speaker, we will open the discussion session for a couple of questions, and then we will move on to the next speaker, and then we'll have a general discussion session at the end of the presentations, and then we'll hand over to Associate Professor Anna Halafov to do the last session. So Anna has already introduced our first speaker, Professor Michael Okyerefo. I will also give a small introduction to him again. So he is a professor of sociology of culture and sociology of religion in the Department of Sociology, University of Ghana. He's keenly interested in Ghana's new churches and their transnational links, migration, African social thought and conceptual categories, and critical studies on the African university. He has published in these areas and is the recipient of awards and grants, including a visiting fellowship on religion and public culture at the University of Cambridge and the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship Program. He is a visiting professor at the Nelson Mandela University, South Africa, and a visiting professor at the University of Ottawa, Canada. So I cordially invite Professor Okyerefo to start presenting his paper now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Praveena. I'm very delighted to be here. I want to thank all of you for inviting me. Let me share my topic, and then I can begin to speak to what I want to do this morning with you and this evening with those who are in the evening. So as you can see, I'm going to speak from Ausländer to Ostländer. Ausländer. I hear that's how you call yourselves, Aussies. So Ausländer is a German term for foreigners, outsiders, non-Austrians, for example, or non-Germans. And that's how foreigners are seen in those places where I have lived and done some work. And the question I'm asking here is, when foreigners come to Australia, do they become Ausländer? Do they become Australians? Those who take the citizenship, how deeply do they feel Australian? Or do they too remain Ausländer, like in the places where I've done my work? That's what I want to speak on. And so basically, Anna and Enchi, thank you for inviting me to be part of this group. It's to speak about my work and see how we can have connections with what you do and whether we can work together in the future. I look forward to that anyway. So I've done some work on Ausländer. Ausländer, foreigners, particularly from Africa to Europe, and in this case, to Austria, where I've lived and worked. And I realized that a lot of the Ghanaian Pentecostal charismatic churches that work in a place like Austria, in Vienna, come there with transnational missions. And working in this kind of global north setting, the kind of work I've done with them argues that religion both helped them and also hindered them. It helped them to feel they belong to one another in space where they do not feel welcome. At the same time, it hindered them from sinking roots in foreign land. So on the one hand, they generate social capital from these churches, which is a kind of effective mechanism to make them survive in an environment which rejects them. On the other hand, the kind of increased interaction they have among themselves makes it hard for those individuals and groups in the end to sink roots in Austria. So the individual reasons why many of these people may not be able to feel they belong vary. And so in other parts of my work, I have sort of reiterated the fact that these people begin to have different identities. They assume different identities. So you will find Ghanaians who have become Austrian by citizenship or are permanent residents, calling themselves Ghanaians, for example. Or some of them will say they are Austrian. Others may say we are Austro-Ghanaian. Still others, Ghanaian-Austrian. They all have a similar kind of background. What explains that? What explains this kind of fractured identity? So in the meantime, their struggle to belong to the host land also sometimes estranges them from their own homeland. They may have lived there for a long time, have children who cannot speak Ghanaian languages, etc. In the midst of all this, the crux of the matter is a misunderstanding of the internal and international migration dynamics. So again, we've done some work on this area, and a colleague of mine at Legon and I have argued that most discussions on migration emphasize international migration. When they talk about migration, they're talking about international migration. They're talking about south-north migration and pay less attention to the internal and south-south flows. And so, for example, the many European scholars, many Europeans who have the misconception that migrants want to flood Europe. They want to flood the West in general, when in fact, most migrants remain in the southern countries, the poorer developing countries. A disproportionate number of migrants, refugees, for example, are found in these countries rather than the richer Western countries. And so within all this, you still find migrants who belong to churches, for example, they have transported into these Western settings, believing that they have a mandate for a kind of reverse mission of the church. So what I did from 2008 and to 2015 was to do some kind of ethnographic work among Ghanaians and some Africans in Austria, and thereby collecting a rich trove of data on migration, transnationalism, diaspora, identity, that shape both individuals and societies. So through this kind of ethnographic work, I have been able to use in-depth been able to unearth in-depth lived experience of some Ghanaians in Austria. And so their life histories very much informed what I have written. Now, when I read the paper of Enchi and Anna and Co. on whiteness, religious diversity, and relational belonging, I thought, oh, this is very interesting because I see here some potential of collaboration in exploring research into these transnational religious flows in the Indian Ocean, because I've been doing that already to the global, to Europe, if you like. If I use global north, you'll be thinking about Australia as well. I haven't done work there. So my earlier projects depict the need to eschew a narrow view of migration from the African continent to Europe. And I've argued that Africans have not just moved to Europe or North America, influenced, as it were, by the colonial history connecting former colonies to the metropoles. Yes, they do move to those places, but your own experience in Australia will tell you, no, that other places like Australia also host Africans. And as they move, religion is a salient aspect of such movement in both ways, mission and reverse mission. There's a need, therefore, to broaden the discussion, the narrative, to include transnational migration flows, religious flows in the Indian Ocean, for example. There's a long history of movement between the African continent, Asia, and Oceania. And that has been ignored from our perspective. So renewed research will draw attention to the need to address this gap. In 2021, there was a study on the transnational political economy of African migration to Australia. And this study provides a renewed interest in transnational flows across the Indian Ocean. It is a collaborative Delphi study of transnational relationships between Africa and Australia, with a focus on Ghana and Kenya. And scholars from the University of Ghana, University of Nairobi, the Organization of African Communities in Western Australia, the University of Western Australia, and the Office of Multicultural Interests, Western Australian Government, were involved in this study, a very in-depth study that has observed that there's a growing diaspora, African diaspora in Australia. The report highlights the social, economic, and political influences that shape the African Australian diaspora and their transnational connections. It also observes that racism and exclusion remain problems for African migrants in Australia, and they have no voice that represents them with the Australian government. However, social and cultural engagements among these Africans in Australia promote identity, well-being, Australian multiculturalism, and transnational connections. Now, such social and cultural engagements set the stage for the need to research into the role of religion in promoting transnational connections. There's this lady, Kaya Abwaji, an Australian also of Ghanaian origin, who has suggested that people of African descent have had a long historical presence in Australia and its adjoining islands through the Bêche-de-Mer trade, whereas Wang and Co. are saying that the African migration to Australia is relatively new. It's a growing phenomenon. So from both perspectives, we can see that, look, there's been a presence for a longer time, but today that presence is growing, is multiplying. And the novelty that this points out is that as a result of this growing kind of presence, there is fertile ground for research into understanding their engagement, their social engagement, their religious engagement, cultural engagement, etc. And so the potential for such a study is great for two reasons. First, it would counterbalance the narrative on the subject of the diaspora, the African diaspora in Europe and in North America. which is hitherto the center of this analysis, particularly from our continent. Secondly, doing investigations by means of interpretative or reconstructive social research, for example, would serve as a mirror for us to understand the breadth and depth of the social and cultural engagements of Africans in Australia. And so that's becoming a great interest for me, given what I've done in the past, and trying to look out for a new sphere of work. So as in the Austrian case, I'm interested in investigating how Ghanaian African migrants in Australia navigate the spheres of citizenship, identity, belonging within the crucible of decoloniality. Yesterday, we heard a lot about decoloniality and in the problems associated with in Australian society itself regarding, those who had been there for thousands of years and those who went later, and now people like Africans who are going are new. And so given they are sinking roots in Australian society, questions on how these spheres of their lives should, questions on these spheres of their lives should be of interest, not only to them, but also to the Australian society. And scholars like us can help to generate the narrative that would inform the discussion. Religious groups of Ghanaians or other African societies that are transported to several parts of the world today, no matter how small, serve as spheres of social and cultural engagements. And they could operate as springboards for such research, as I've learned in the Austrian case. Yet again, I think ethnographic work would serve a purpose, deploying interviews, in-depth analysis of life histories, of a cross-section of such people, Ghanaians of Ghanaian origin, of African origin, that could be pivotal to construct a narrative on the transnational, religious, cultural engagements of Africans across the Indian Ocean. And that is why, to conclude, thinking about it, having done work on Ausländer and trying to move to the Australian terrain, how well would these people consider themselves, or are they considered by the Australian society? Are they Ausländer? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that engaging and very interesting presentation, Michael. So now I would invite any questions from the audience based on the presentation. Yes, William.
Thank you, Praveena. Michael, thank you for your presentations, and thank you for watching and tracing out some of the things that happened to the African community in Australia. I'm aware, yes, I have worked with the African community, communities, including the Ghanaian communities, but I was wondering, the issues that the Ghanaian communities face are also similar issues that the African communities group face in Australia. If I was wondering whether there is opportunity for you to think in a larger scale, looking at the African populations within Australia in terms of research, and looking at, similar to what you just said, the role of religions in supporting them to build their social capital, and how they can extend it to the other type of capitals, such as psychological capital, economic capitals, if you like. So I think it's something that we can also discuss later if you are not if you are not leaving early. I would love to discuss this with Anna and the team. But I thought just to throw that for you to reflect on it if possible.
Okay, thank you very much, William. First of all, as I said in the beginning, I'm delighted to be invited to this group. Anna and I have been talking about this for years. And at this point, I think I want to make time to do new things. So rather than concentrate on that one narrative, I'm looking forward to extending to other places like Australia, especially now. So yes, talking about the Ghanaian experience and the report I referred to, for example, has put into perspective the similarities with other African societies, African groups that are present in Australia. So yeah, depending on what we agree on, and I'll stay for the discussion, we can talk about larger scale of work and perhaps even for a longer time, which will be much more meaningful than working on smaller groups. Yes, so that would be a great idea. Thank you.
That will be fantastic, because Anna and I are, and also Enki, we are very passionate working with the African communities in this area in Australia.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? We can take one more question and then move to the next presenter. Yes, Joanna.
Thank you and good morning. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, great. Thank you very much for that really fascinating presentation. That's really so interesting to hear about the similarities and connections to work that those of us who are working on Australia are familiar with. I'm a historian rather than a social scientist, and my focus is actually the 19th century mostly, and the kinds of, and I have a particular interest in the kinds of connections within the British Empire between Christian colonized people or colonized people who converted to Christianity. And one of the things that I'm interested in that context is the way in which often the Christian bodies, the international Christian bodies that Christian people from Africa or Asia were part of, that these institutions were very much dominated by people from the global north, by white people, and yet within specific contexts, of course, Christian communities develop their own cultures and leadership. So that's sort of a lengthy, that's just a bit of context as to why I'm asking this question. I suppose my question is about how in the context that you're looking at of Ghanaian Pentecostal people, are most of the communities that you're looking at part of international Pentecostal bodies that are still largely led from the US, I guess would be the obvious candidate, or from Europe? Or are these indigenous Ghanaian Pentecostal movements? And how does that, whatever the answer is to that, how does that shape their, I suppose, senses of belonging, the cultural tensions that they face? I just would be interested if you could comment on that at all.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. So this is a very wonderful question, and an important one from a historical perspective, because, well, let me begin from the back. These are independent Ghanaian African churches. These are churches now, as you know, the growth of Pentecostalism, particularly in the global South, in Africa, in South America, and parts of Asia, that's led by indigenous people. These are pastors, individual pastors that found their churches. And within those countries, they tend to have coalitions called Pentecostal councils, etc. But they're individual churches. So the Lighthouse Chapel International, which I studied in Vienna, for example, founded by some medical doctor in Ghana, has branches in other parts of Africa and in Europe, particularly among Ghanaians, which is part of the problem, and then other Africans, which sort of makes them interact among themselves. Well, part of the problem is that Christianity itself and its history has sort of been, misconstrued even on this continent, on the continent of Africa, because the first century Christianity was already in Africa, North Africa, as you know, before the colonization sort of brought Christianity to the continent from the 14th, 15th century. So, and many Christians do not even appreciate this history. What they appreciate now is how colonialism has sort of, made them first lose the identity as Africans before becoming Christians. And to fight that, they want to found their own churches, which is great for them. But it would be wonderful if they put that whole thing, experience, into this lengthy historical perspective and see how that will play out. So yeah, to answer your question, history is so much important in what we are doing for us as sociologists also, because it helps sort of straighten the narrative, and also when interviewing these people to interrogate what they understand about Christianity itself and the version of Christianity they are preaching today, compared to what was brought to the continent and what already existed, from the first century, whether they could make connections there with that, all those experiences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Okyerefo. So we will, for now, move on to the second presenter, but there will be time again to ask any questions from Professor Okyerefo if you have any. So we will move on to the next presenter. Our second presenter for today is Dr. Dickie Sofian. So Dr. Sofjan is a co-doctoral faculty in the Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies, based in the Graduate School of University Gadjah Mada in Yogyakarta. So his interests include religion and politics, Islam, ethics, and sustainability. So now I cordially invite you, Dr. Sofjan, to start your presentation, please. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and blessings be upon you all. Thank you very much, Praveena, as the moderator. And I'd like to thank Angie and also Anna for inviting me. And I think you forgot that we also met during the American Academy of Religion conference in 2016 in San Antonio, Texas. Yeah. And I think I had my arm busted up during that time after my conference in University of California at Riverside. Anyways, I'd like to preempt this presentation, which is entitled Islam Nusantara as a Decolonizing Project. And obviously this is a work in progress. I've done some work on Islam in Indonesia and how it's sort of affected by Shiism, for instance, from the flow, the transnational flow of Shiism from Iran, from Persia, the subcontinent of Asia, India, and other places. Yeah, but I'd like to just sort of introduce the subject by saying that, there's been a lot of discourse and discussion and debate about Indonesian Islam ever since, obviously, post-Reformasi by the works of Lafan, Person, and others. And it has become somewhat of a catch-all phrase that leaves more questions than answers. Yeah. Some have focused more on the conservative turn in the works of Homayatsu and Van Brunissen, Noor Ikhwan, and others. But also there's sort of dissipating face of the smiley Islam that has somewhat sort of gone onto the background of the scene in Indonesia. Other scholars such as Burhani, Sofjan, and Sharif have also emphasized the increasing level of intolerance, most notably toward the Muslim quote and unquote religious minorities, as well as the religious others and the non-gender conforming groups in society. Some have done their work more specifically on trying to describe and elaborate what Indonesian Islam is and is not. Some you would probably be able to find in Abdul Mutti's work, or Najib Burhani and others. And also some by more sort of partial scholarships by scholars from the Nahdlatul Ulama, who like to propagate about Islam Nusantara and also Islam Berkemajuan by Muhammadiyah intellectuals, and also Islam Wasatiyah, or the Middle Islam, by more sort of Sufi-leaning scholars. But all of these are manifestations of Indonesian Muslim struggle in how they define themselves as Muslims, and how it relates to the sort of internal struggle and strife for the soul of Indonesian Islam. So henceforth, this article is an attempt to analyze how Islam Nusantara is defined and propagated amid the sort of growing conservatism ushered in by transnational Islamic religious movements deriving from the Middle East, South Asia, and elsewhere. But I'd like to focus more on how the role of the Hizb ut-Tahrir Indonesia, the HTI, and also the Neo-Salafi / Wahhabi movement in Indonesia, and how they have sort of hijacked some portions of the Islamic discourse and tried to Arabicize some of the more core sort of essential teachings and doctrines of Islam. So the imperative to categorically define and systematize Indonesian form of Islam has its roots in the traditionalists' worldview, an effort to offset the sort of proclivity toward the Arabization of Islam. And such trend is profoundly evident in the more modernist, upper middle class and urban Muslims who are prone to romanticizing the golden age of Islam, and are invariably entrenched in what the late Professor Shafi'i Ma'arif, a former leader of Muhammadiyah, calls misguided Arabism. So using post-colonial theories, decolonial theories and approaches, the article examines the discontentment and contention associated with Islam Nusantara and the way forward for Indonesian Islam. In terms of the theoretical terrain, the theory of decoloniality stems from the concern over colonial practices of the past, which have impinged many nations that arose mostly from the Second World War and decades thereafter. And so it assumes sort of a system of knowledge as we know it, which has somewhat been influenced and shaped by the imperial interest and agenda of the colonialists. So to me, coloniality theories and a body of literature creates an imbalanced view of the world. And this effort sort of to homogenize the reality of modernization, industrialization, secularization, based mostly on Western European and American experiences. What is more, these experiences are largely biased towards societies that are embedded in Judeo-Christian traditions, meaning to say that any one people or nation that are not part of the Judeo-Christian spiritual influence must deal with, negotiate, and eventually succumb to the brutal logic and practices of their former colonial masters, despite already attaining their formal independence. The sad truth is that such realization of coloniality is hardly perceived, much less challenged by the former colonized people. Yeah? To the colonized people, that sad reality is the truth and the way it ought to be. And so the discourse on democracy, authoritarianism, and human rights, for instance, provides a glimpse at how these socio-political discourses are politically deployed and conveniently used to the advantage of the former colonialists and at the expense of the lesser, weaker, and vulnerable people that must comply with the new standards. And so for many years, the discourse on coloniality, decoloniality, and post-colonialism have been associated with Latin America's liberation theology and reflections on their lived experiences, having to live next door to a superpower whose military might always seem to determine the right or wrong of a society. I think the work of Andre Gunder Frank and the Development and Revolution, 1969, provides a clear pathway to understanding how colonialism remains at work and how it provided a fertile ground for revolutions. Yeah. Subsequently, after Latin America, I think we saw the Middle East becoming a sort of a staging theater and locus for post-colonial reflections. And given its harsh and treacherous history and also the region's entanglement with European, American, and Zionist forms of annexation, exploitation, and extraction, Islam, Arabs, and Muslims of the Middle East became effectively the bogeyman of the world. And so this was categorically described and elaborated well by Edward Said in his seminal works on Orientalism, culture, and imperialism. But also Said's notion of blaming the victim also is relevant to the overall argument and analysis against the colonized nations. And I think oftentimes we forget about this argument and tend to sort of reinforce the argument of the colonial masters. More recently, I think the study and research on de- and post-coloniality has also sort of entered Southeast Asia, being a region with almost all, with the exception of Thailand, still grappling with how to disengage with the long and brutal past under the European imperial powers and subsequently American military expansion. Many of the studies have reflected on the brutal experiences of people living under authoritarianism or dictatorial rule and military regimes. Some of these works, such as Leong and Yulianto, for instance, have touched upon the 1965 purge of the communists and massacre of the left-leaning political cadres of the PKI, or the Indonesian Communist struggle. So against this background in Latin America, Middle East, and Southeast Asia, decolonial and post-colonial theories attempt to disrupt, destabilize the discourse, and ultimately the colonial practices embedded in many of the sort of social practices and also body of knowledge in literature, anthropology, political science, international relations, and I would say religious studies as well. So transnational Islam and its discontent. So my paper essentially tries to examine a different way of looking at and analyzing the transnational forms of Islam that is currently engulfing Indonesia. And I would perhaps comment by saying that Islam is perhaps one of the most transnational religions of the world. It is also, I would argue, perhaps the most urban religion ever to grow and expand. Hence the effectiveness of its transnational network of the ulama, the Sufis and merchants in bygone eras are really sort of very evident and a good testimony of this statement. I think the work of Azimadi Azra on the ulama network, for instance, in the 17th and 18th century provides a clear sort of elaboration on this argument. And so the manifestation of it unfolds in the widespread culture of Arabism that seems to be impossible to decouple with Islam. The existence of the Laskar Jihad, the FPI, the Islamic Defenders Front, Jamaah Islamiyah, Majlis Mujahidin Indonesia, and others is a testament to the popular Arab subculture that highly values the strict and scripturalist form of Islam. There's no wonder that the Arabization of Islam is often highly associated with the radicalization of Islam. And so coincidentally, these organizations are led by preachers who are descendants of the people of the Arabian Peninsula, most notably from the Hadramaut region, which extends the Yemen region today. This is not to say that all Hadramaut descendants in the Indo-Malay archipelago are necessarily violent, intolerant, and anti-pluralism, because many of the same breed of people have spurred the numerous Sufi orders and schools throughout the region. The works of Van Brunesen, for instance, and Fajri Ismail Alatas would probably tell you more about this. And so although the trend toward radicalization, religious extremism, and terrorism seem to have slowly dissipated on the surface, the undercurrent and threat remains powerfully potent and invariably latent. Yeah? Thus, our real and present danger lies from the transnational religious movements, bringing in exogenous values, foreign ideologies, and religious sentiments that are somewhat alien to both the local context, culture, and the human experience of the Muslim population at large in the Indo-Malay archipelago. But this can also apply to other religious communities, such as the Christians, the Hindus, the Buddhists, who are also facing the same kind of sort of transnational influences coming in from different parts of the world. The rise of the Hizb ut-Tahrir in Indonesia and the Neo-Salafi Wahhabi movement are now a lot more difficult to handle by the authorities and security apparatus, as they have been successful in permeating the government and its bureaucracy, universities, and even military and police. The influence and sway have reached the political elites and socialites and even celebrities who have found themselves to be born-again Muslims, ironically, often providing legal opinions in the mass media and social media about Islamic jurisprudence or fiqh. In many ways, both the HTI and the Neo-Salafi Wahhabi movement preachers have promulgated public debates and issues that are highly non-contextual and retrogressive. These discourses, more often than not, tended to bring in the sort of Middle Eastern, read Arabic, politics to the foreground, without much consideration for the rich culture, customs, and traditions of mostly indigenous Indonesians. So on the one hand, the Hatta is known for its desire to reconstitute the Khilafah or the Caliphate, arguing that the anachronistic system is the ultimate answer to all the problems of the nation state, politics and economics, and all forms of corruption and injustices. The Neo-Salafi Wahhabi movement, which has an army of preachers who graduated from Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, desires to see Indonesia become like the autocratic absolutist kingdom, while arguing that Indonesians must return to the Quran and Sunnah, or the scripture and the prophetic tradition. So within this context, Indonesian Islam has come to the fore to challenge many of the basic and blatant assumptions of these latecomers in Islam. The work of Lafan, for instance, lays out the basic contentions within the idea and framework of Indonesian Islam. In many meaningful ways, this is also a thread that is linked to the idea of religious nationalism, but not exactly, not wholly. I mean, the recent work of Reverend Angela Denker, I was a speaker in one of the Blue Table seminars held by Globe Ethics, for instance. Reverend Denker, for instance, in the United States provides a good study of religious nationalism in the United States. But the difference being that religious nationalists tend to be small, righteous, and retrogressive, although one might argue that during the Trump presidency that there was a rise and an increase in their participation in politics and and making the noise at the national level. The religious nationalist in Indonesia is much more traditional, centered, and non-populist. Yeah, and so one of the, I think, most important and profound idea that these movements bring is this idea about religious authenticity. So they believe in sort of a dictatorship of authenticity, and how without it, Indonesians will forever be lost and never be saved again. A supporter of Habib Rizik, the leader of the Front Pembela Islam, for instance, Habib Bahar bin Smith, a firebrand preacher, had once said that if the Arab ulama had not come to Indonesia, Dudung, who's the Jakarta military commander, would still be worshipping trees. So such statement obviously is very sort of typical, yeah, for those transnationalist Muslims who are more sort of influenced by HTI and the Neo-Salafi Wahhabi movement. And so they have this sort of logic of what Shafi Marif earlier mentioned about the misguided Arabism. And to them, the argument goes that Islam was born in the Arab land, the Prophet Muhammad was an Arab, and the Quranic scripture revealed is in the Arabic language. And therefore, Islam and the Arab culture are intertwined. And while the argument holds true and is logically correct, the intent of the statement is to say that the Indonesian Muslims need to do away with their local cultures, customs, and traditions, which are seen to them as Hindu practices and containing syncretic sort of teachings that are impermissible to the more authenticated form of Islam. And so this has been somewhat used effectively as a mantra for many of those transnationally minded Muslims to judge traditional Indonesian Muslims, notably from the Nahdlatul Ulama, of engaging in shirk or polytheistic practices, which are indeed impermissible and constitute a grave sin in Islam. And therefore, practices such as visiting of the tombs of the saints, celebrating the anniversary of the Prophet Muhammad, and the commemoration of the death of the leader of the saints, Hussein, the Prophet's grandson, are all seen as contradictions to the authenticity of Islam and against the movement to the return to the Quran and the Sunnah. So this intertwining of Islam and Arab identity has somewhat become the current sort of colonial logic of some segments of the Indonesian Muslim upper middle class urbanites who have a liking to attend to pengajians or religious tutoring, majlis taklims, learning circles, and tabligh akbars, religious gatherings. So in this paper, I'd like to sort of pose the argument in defense of Islam Nusantara. And one would think that Islam Nusantara would not in any way offend or incite a strong reaction from Indonesian Muslims at large, given its traditionally strong national sentiment across the country. And of course, as you know, Nusantara is the archaic name of the Indo-Malay archipelago, which stretches beyond the national territories of Indonesia today. But however, Islam Nusantara sits in the middle of a controversy that brings together the modernists and the pro-Arabists to stand in the way for its propagation and formal acceptance into the Indonesian discourse and practices. So the same kind of group of people would probably, chant that, Islam needs no adjectives, that Islam is the solution, and so on and so forth. Yeah. But I'm also aware of the fact that within the sort of movement to propagate Indonesian Islam, that there is a contention, that there is a debate within and among the groups, the moderate groups in Indonesia. Obviously, as you know, Islam Nusantara is much propagated by the Nahdlatul Ulama, and then the Islam Berkemajuan or Progressive Islam is by Muhammadiyah, and also the Islam Wasatiyah, which is much more sort of promulgated by the Indonesian Muslim Sufis. Yeah, but I think all in all, these three sort of discourses and arguments on Indonesian Islam are against the idea of the sort of more puritanical form of Islam. And so looking at Islam Nusantara as a decolonizing project, I mean, if decolonialism and post-colonial theories' main objective is to disrupt, destabilize, and dislodge the powers that be, then Islam Nusantara, despite its partiality, is an effective discursive tool to challenge the predominance and preeminence of the Arab identity and culture among the more traditional Indonesian Muslims. In that sense, Islam Nusantara has become invariably a way for Indonesian Muslims to distance themselves from the misguided Arabism that seems to engulf a great portion of the modernist upper middle class Muslim urbanites. It presupposes an Islam that is culturally in sync with local traditions, beliefs, and customs. Yeah, the expropriation of Islam by the Wahhabis, the Neo-Salafis, and the Hateis from the traditionalist viewpoint has become somewhat unbearable for those who desire for a more cultural form of Islam that is open and tolerant toward the local practices and indigenous communities. The discontentment toward Islam Nusantara clearly shows a contention between the traditionalists Muslims and the modernists, but both obviously want a voice in the way that Islam is understood and practiced in Indonesia. Yeah, so I think I'll just stop at that point and provide some opportunity for questions and answers. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.